Hello, and welcome to the very third episode of Just Jank. I'm your hosty with the mosty, Brioni Elboni Aroni. That'll do it for the untap step. Let's go to the upkeep. This episode is brought to you by Wendell's Real Food and Drive-In. Wendell's, come because you thought this was a Wendy's, stay because you work here now. Here in the upkeep, we review what is jank. Cards are not janky, decks are. You could have a deck with a price point in the several thousands of dollars, and it could still be janky. If you're trying to tell a story, if you're trying to win with Elk Tribal, if your whole goal is simply to not let the game win, you might have a jank deck. But just because a deck focuses on convoluted combos and win conditions, or throws those concepts out the window, doesn't mean you shouldn't play them. Jank is art. It's finding a way to express something about you, or the game itself. We mentioned a high price point a minute ago, so let's also remember what jank isn't. Sacrificing power. Certainly, as we'll see today, even just jank can embrace the spicy side of life. So let's find out more in the draw step. Today's deck is my very third deck that I saved on Scryfall.com, and it features Alesha, who smiles at death. This is a Mardu recursion deck, and fair warning, recursion is going to be a theme in Just Jank going forward. After all, why do something once when you can do it multiple times? Alesha is a 3/2 legendary human warrior for 2 and a red, and she reads, First strike. Whenever Alesha, who smiles at death, attacks, you may pay Orjav. If you do, return target creature with power 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield, tapped and attacking. This is a fantastic ability. This deck is going to be primarily combat focused, and essentially it's weenie tribal. Alesha recurs the smaller creatures from our graveyard, so we want to focus on those cards to have the most options. Additionally, since they need to be in the graveyard in order for Alesha to recur them, we want them to have either enters the battlefield effects, or dies effects, or ideally, both. Finally, since combat is sort of a precarious point in the game to focus our attention on, we need to be able to protect our commander, even though she does already have first strike. So let's find out how we set up our game plan in the pre-combat main phase. Here in the pre-combat main phase, we talk about setting up our board state and getting our game plan going. As usual, that starts with ramp. In this deck, we're back up to 3 whole mana rocks: Soul Ring, Mind Stone, and Commander Sphere. I always like to include Commander Sphere in a multicolored deck because it can sacrifice itself for a card if we're going to lose our artifacts anyway. Speaking of artifacts, Expedition Map is a fantastic include because it pulls any one of our lands out of our deck, and Traveler's Amulet and Wayfarer's Bauble pull fetches out, which is pretty great. Speaking of basics, let's get into our recursion pieces with Burnished Heart, which is a 2/2 elk, so it's recurable by Alesha, and it sacrifices itself for 2 basics. Similarly, Pilgrim's Eye enters the battlefield for a basic, and is a 1/1 flyer. So if we need flying blockers, it can serve as one, and Alesha can recur it to keep thinning our deck and ramping us. Cryptghast, although it doesn't have an enters the battlefield or dies effect, essentially doubles our black mana production, and it has an extort ability, which might give us just that little bit of an edge we need later in the game. Pitiless Plunderer is another mythic uncommon, and since our creatures should be dying as often as possible, we should be awash in treasures. And speaking of treasures, we have access to white, so we're running Smothering Tithe. If you can, you basically have to, especially if you don't have access to green. Black Market is another fantastic include, just like Pitiless Plunderer. Our creatures should be dying a lot, and hopefully our opponent's creatures will be dying, so in our pre-combat main phase, we should be flush with black mana, hopefully to pay for more sacrifice abilities, or just creature costs, or extort. Ashnod's Altar and Phyrexian Altar are incredibly powerful artifacts to include in the deck, and they're part of what make this deck so spicy. It's an aristocrats deck. It's got a lot of really powerful effects when things die, so we want to try and maximize that as much as possible and control it outside of combat as well. If our creatures are going to die anyway, we should sacrifice them for mana. And finally, Demonic Tutor and Diabolic Tutor. Technically, they can get any card out of our deck, but we've all been in that game where the best thing we can use it for is to find a land. And that's okay. Everybody's done it. Speaking of lands, we've got the usual assortment of a few shocks and a few fetches, including non-basic fetches, although Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse are still in the deck. And for utility lands, some very notable includes. Bojuka Bog should be in every deck that has access to black. The ability to nuke an opponent's graveyard is key. People are going to want to nuke our graveyard. We're a recursion deck, and if they take away our graveyard, they're effectively taking away our hand, pretty much. Rogue's Passage is especially useful in this deck because Alesha needs to go to combat and attack, and we don't want her to die. So if we can give her unblockable, we should. And finally, Volrath's Stronghold is a massive recursion piece. Maybe Alesha can't pull everything we want out of the graveyard. Maybe Alesha gets removed herself. We still want to have as much access to our enter the battlefield and sacrifice effects as possible. So I've mentioned combat quite a few times by now, so let's go to the combat step and really talk about the bulk of the deck. Welcome to the combat step. As I mentioned earlier, this is a combat-focused deck. Alesha needs to be on the battlefield to really drive the deck forward, and her ability triggers when she attacks. Because she pulls creatures out of the graveyard, we want to focus first on some enter the battlefield effects. First up is Murderous Redcap. When it enters, it shoots something for its power. That's 2 by default, and when it dies, it has a persist trigger, so it'll come back with a -1/-1 counter and zap something for 1 more damage. If we can recur this several turns in a row, because Alesha recurs it without counters, maybe we can really stack up the damage. Siege Gang Commander is a fantastic include in the deck, because the more times we recur it, the more goblins we get. Go wide is a really good way to protect our commander, because the wider we go, the more blockers we punch through. Speaking of punching through, Duplicant is a fantastic recursion piece, because not only do we get a tapped and attacking body on the board, but it exiles one of our opponent's blockers probably, or maybe just really solid utility pieces out from under them. Disciple of Bolas is an interesting include, because it does remove one of our creatures, but we get to draw possibly quite a few cards and gain some life back. We probably want to recur this one as often as possible as well. Speaking of recursion, why not have a 2-for-1? Karmic Guide lets us pull out an angel onto the battlefield and then pull out something else at the same rate or power as Alesha herself. It's a great deal. And finally, Great Merchant of Asphodel. Gary's in the deck. If we get enough black pips on the board, we might just win the game. But at least we'll probably get a fair amount of life off of our opponents and into our own life total. Now for some exceptions. Mentor of the Meek is not an enters the battlefield effect itself, but when Alesha recurs something, if we can pay 2 mana to recur it, maybe we can pay 2 more to draw a card off of it. Wall of Reverence doesn't really have anything to do with recursion, but other players in the game do get a combat step as well, so a 1/6 wall that gains us life on our end step is a really good idea. Krenko Tin Street Kingpin is actually a non-bow with Alesha. She returns it tapped and attacking, so it misses its attack trigger, but if we can have him attack multiple times in a row, we'll start to really go wide, along with Siege Gang Commander. Master of Cruelties is admittedly a pet card. It's really hard to get this thing to work. But the more recursion we do, the more likely it is that we actually get to swing through, and the more likely it is that we reduce our opponents to 1 life. And if we're really lucky, maybe we have a Murderous Redcap with a persist ability that we can sacrifice somehow. Then we've got Ilharg the Razeboar, which does not work with Alesha at all, but it does let us drop out freebies onto the board. We want to save our mana for Alesha's ability and probably Mentor of the Meek. So Ilharg, dropping out creatures from our hand, is a really good saving strategy. Urabrask the Hidden, definitely not a synergy, but it does give Alesha and our other creatures haste, and it taps our opponent's creatures when they enter the battlefield, which is really useful because we want them to have as few blockers as possible. Some non-creature synergies that we really want to exploit are Warstorm Surge, which is a fantastic ETB zap effect, especially if we can get that 2-for-1 with Karmic Guide. Electropotence, which is sort of a mini Warstorm Surge. And Mirror March, which is absolutely bonkers if we can get it to hit a couple times. This is a really fun pet card, admittedly. It's very unlikely that you'll get more than 2 hits off of Mirror March. In fact, I've had multiple games in a row where I've had 0 hits off of Mirror March the entire game. But to make up for that, we've got Vicious Shadows. It's combat. Hopefully stuff dies to blockers or attackers, and Vicious Shadows is going to deal massive damage when that happens. It's a fantastic card and is probably actually a little bit too spicy in most scenarios. Speaking of spice, Dictate of Erebos is in the deck. I actually look back on this list with some regret. My play group doesn't really view this card in a good light, and I've come to agree with them. It just really raises a lot of bad feelings. So I would suggest, unless your play group firmly says they're okay, don't play Dictate effects. It just makes things not fun, and it really makes this deck look like kind of a jerk. Some more non-creature effects. We've got 4 Planeswalkers. All of them sort of help us go wide, but maybe they have some other stuff that help us out too. Angrath, Captain of Chaos, gives our creatures Menace, which is really useful because we want Alesha to encounter as few blockers as possible to stay on the board as long as possible. Sorin's Solemn Visitor maybe helps us go wide, maybe it gives us an Anthem, maybe it just absorbs a few hits with its loyalty counters. Sorin Vengeful Bloodlord gives us lifelink and maybe a little bit of extra recursion as well. We probably need as much as we can get. And finally, Liliana Dreadhorde General. One of the better versions of Liliana, I think, especially in a deck that wants creatures to die as often as possible. She just has a static ability that when our creatures die, we draw a card, and plus we'll probably just use her plus ability to make some zombies and go a-swinging. So with all that said, let's go to the post-combat main stage and find out some of the other things we can do with our creatures outside and around combat to really hit the game home. Welcome to the post-combat main phase. In this part of the show, we normally talk about keeping our momentum going, protecting our game plan, and closing the game out. But this deck is probably going to close the game out, so we are only going to touch on that for one card. For momentum, let's talk about card advantage with some really fun red effects. Heartwarming Redemption is a self-wheel, so we can pitch cards that we might not want and look for something a little bit better. Theater of Horrors is your standard exile impulse draw, predicated on opponent's loss of life, which we should be able to manage. And even if we can't, it has that ability stapled on for 4 mana to drain our opponents. We also have 2 more demonic tutor effects in the deck in the form of Sidisi Undead Vizier, which exploits one of our creatures, sacrificing it, which we know we want to do, and Runescarred Demon, which is basically just an enter the battlefield demonic tutor. And although these are very strong creatures, both of them are way too big to recur with Alesha or Karmic Guide, or our next recursion piece, Revelark. Although Revelark recurs creatures when it leaves the battlefield. So a really fun interaction is Sidisi exploiting Revelark. It's a ton of fun. I highly suggest everybody do it if they have the opportunity. Next up, let's talk about some momentum via death and sacrifice synergies. Cruel Celebrant cares about when creatures die and hurts our opponents. It's a standard effect. It's really useful. Hopefully all of our creatures will be dying often enough that it'll just add up over time and give us that edge we need. Similarly, Vindictive Vampire, although this one hurts opponents and gains us life. Judith the Scourge Diva slowly becomes a big fat beater over time, and when she does die, we can just shoot something for her power, which can be very useful. We've got Yahenni Undying Partisan, and since this is a combat deck, we know we want him to be swinging in, probably indestructible, because we can use his ability to sacrifice one of our creatures to render him immune from damage and destroy effects, and when maybe he takes down another opponent's creature, or one of our effects kills a blocker, he just keeps getting bigger. And finally, Undercity Informer. This is the one card that could close the game out outside of combat. We can sacrifice creatures to have opponents mill until they hit a land card. So if we have a board full of creatures and we can sacrifice enough of them all at once, this might mill an opponent out. It's a lot of fun, but it's pretty unlikely. Next up, to protect our game plan, let's talk about some of our protection and removal spells. Toxic Deluge is in the deck, which is incredibly powerful because it gets around indestructible, but it does cost life to cast. This should work out with cards like Vindictive Vampire, so hopefully we won't have to hurt ourselves too much in case we face a board that's a little too big. Next up, we've got Dispark and Utter End, which are targeted exile effects. This is especially useful because our deck is a graveyard recursion deck. Our opponents can use those same tools against us, but if we exile, can't recur it easily. We've also got Mortify and Wear and Tear, both of which remove enchantments with an optional other mode. Mortify can also remove a creature, and Wear and Tear can remove an artifact. They're fantastic modal spells, and I really think more people should be running them. We've also got Hide and Seek, which we'll probably use for its hide, which is basically a Chaos Warp effect, and shuffles a permanent into an opponent's deck. But if we get lucky, we can also use Seek, and just exile an opponent's card out from their library and gain a little bit of life doing it. We've also got Fume Spitter to slowly over time recur and put -1/-1 counters on opponent's creatures. It sacrifices itself, which is very useful if they get rid of our other sack outlets, and it slowly removes threats, or at least makes them less threatening. I think Fume Spitter should be regarded as a commander staple, and if you have one, you should put it in your black decks. We've also got Selfless Spirit, which is just a blanket protection effect with another self-sacrifice ability. These are going to be really key, and we're probably going to want to recur these as often as possible, especially if we're facing a lot of opposition. Dragonscale General is a slow protection over time in the form of making some of our creatures bigger. It's got Bolster X, where X is the number of tapped creatures we have on the end of our turn. So it's not super useful going into combat, but over time, as the turns progress, maybe we make some of our army bigger and bigger and able to break through. And finally, we've got Cryptborn Horror, which is a weird include, I'll admit. If we recur it with Alesha, it just dies, because it only gets counters according to how much mana we spend on it. But maybe we recur it anyway for a quick enter the battlefield immediate death trigger. Maybe with the Cruel Celebrant, maybe with the Vindictive Vampire. Maybe we just need that one more damage. It could happen. So, we've talked about the ways that we can try to keep our acceleration going, and we can try to protect our board. Now let's go to the end step and try and figure out how I can justify this as janky. Welcome to the end step, the part of the show where we try to justify all of the overpowered cards that go into the deck and explain why this deck is still janky. For Alesha, it's because the deck completely revolves around combat. If we can't get Alesha to go to combat and actually attack, the deck basically falls apart. We have cards like Lightning Greaves, Swiftfoot Boots, Rogue's Passage, and Selfless Spirit, but that's really the long and short of all of our protection to keep her from dying in combat. If we're seriously trying to win as hard as possible, our tutors have to go to those pieces, and not the overwhelming brutality of Dictate of Erebos and Vicious Shadows. The whole deck falls apart if we're not recurring creatures, and Alesha is the focal point of that recursion. It's just as likely that we draw into commander staples like Fume Spitter and Master of Cruelties as anything else, and while they're incredibly fun, and more people should play them, it's really hard to abuse them in the short term. The deck needs Alesha to attack over and over and over again. We're also incredibly vulnerable to blue magic, such as just counterspell or especially bounce effects, and in all likelihood we're going to need to politic our way into several free attacks. For example, if we know that we're going to go into combat and attack, and the table sees duplicant in our graveyard, they're probably going to want to stop us. So we're probably going to have to lean into some of our temporary friendships and allies to be able to swing Alesha somewhere safe and get that duplicant out, but only to deal with a table-wide threat. Don't get me wrong, this deck has a lot of power, but it could be a lot worse. Thank you for listening. With all that said, let's go to the cleanup step. Welcome to the cleanup step. Thanks again so much for watching. We want to thank our sponsors, whoever they are, whenever they decide to exist. Special thanks to Ben Culp of Once Lizard, Sometimes Snake for our theme song. You can check out his work at olss.space. Please go check out his recent album, Parable of the Dreamer, if you missed it last time. Finally, to the charlatans at Wizards of the Coast. Commander staples, such as Fume Spitter and Master of Cruelties, don't cost very much, but a lot of Commander staples are continually at a premium, and the time has come to reprint Commander Staple Seed Time in jumbo-sized foil. Please do that. That'll do it for this episode. Thanks so much for watching, and remember, you don't need a great deck to have a great time. See ya.